Okay. Richard, I'm calling to order the special meeting of the Santa Monica Planning Commission for May 20th. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi, not yet here. Commissioner Fresco.
Here.
Commissioner Landris.
Here.
Commissioner McKinnon.
Present.
Commissioner Pastor.
Present.
And Chair Lambert.
Here. Okay, I'm going to make an announcement that item 9B.
Commissioner Reese is here too, by the way. Commissioner Reese is here. Commissioner
Can you
Reese
hear
is
me?
here too.
Hello?
Hello.
Yeah.
And you guys,
Item
Commissioner Reed
9.
was not acknowledged.
Can we,
Sorry, Commissioner Reese.
can we calm down here? Item 9B, the Carthorpe project has been pulled for a future date. What's going on? Can you hear me?
Jim
Yeah.
was trying to tell us that he's here, and Jim was trying to call his roll. That's all.
Call his own roll? Okay.
Jim is. Are we all agreed? Jim is here.
Whatever.
Jim is here. Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Okay.
Onward and upward. Item 9B is not going to be heard tonight. It's been put over. So that's off the agenda for those of you watching. And for those of you watching who wish to make a comment to the commission during the meeting, the way to do that is to email planningcomment at smgov.net. That's planningcomment at smgov.net. And we will get your email and staff will read it to us. And I want to tonight emphasize the importance. If any of you want to talk, please use the chat room. And I promise to look at it. And I promise not to ignore you. Or at least most of you. So can we have the planning director's report?
good evening or good afternoon, Chair Lambert and Planning Commission. I have a short report tonight. We don't have a lot coming up on our upcoming agendas. On June 3rd, there's a CUP for an office and gym at 1820 Broadway. And then coming up at City Council on June 9th is the SB 743 discussion that the Commission had recently. The only other thing I wanted to mention is there is an updated emergency order regarding boards and commissions. So if you're interested, you may want to take a look at that. Basically what it does is establish that, like, for example, the Planning Commission can meet, but it should be for those items that are really absolutely necessary to perform the duties of the Commission. And then, the other boards and commissions are treated slightly differently. In some cases, it describes they should only meet if absolutely necessary. And then others are just more or less put on hold for the duration. One of the things that we'll be doing in the interim while we work our way through this process is figuring out exactly what the reimagined design review process looks like and what role the ARB would play. And then also looking at the Landmarks Commission and figuring out how we can reduce the expense and time, staff time that goes into running that commission, and figuring out just what that looks like. We don't have that yet, but that is what we're working on. So that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions.
I have a question regarding the Landmarks Commission and the ARB. Is it my understanding that is Landmarks on hiatus or furlough or whatever, or are they still meeting?
I don't think they've met, Jing. Maybe you could answer that. I don't know if they've met recently.
No, the Landmarks Commission is on temporary hiatus as well. Yeah.
And what are you doing if an applicant requires Landmarks approval on something?
We have not had that request.
Okay.
So we have not scheduled a meeting.
And the ARB is still in. Use the chat room, please. The ARB is still intact, right?
The ARB is meeting, yes, because we have a huge backlog of projects to make through on the ARB. So the ARB is meeting.
And some of those were settlement agreements that had to get through the process in a limited amount of time.
Right. Commissioner Fresco has a question. Your mic is off.
I think she's on mute.
Your mic is off.
How do we find the emergency order, please?
It's on the city website.
Just on the homepage in the COVID-19 stuff?
Yeah, I just typed in city emergency orders regarding boards and commissions, and it popped up. So that'll take you to the right page.
It's at the
Okay,
city's
thank you.
the coronavirus website, santamonica.gov/coronavirus.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Question for David. Is this new ordinance finance driven to economize or health driven because we can't be talking next door to each other or whatever? What's the relative? Let's say-
Well, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both. It's not an ordinance; it's just an emergency order. So that's one clarification. But yeah, it's really just in light of the the staff, the fact that staff is working remotely, the fact that we can't get back into the council chambers and hold meetings. So it's just an effort to put any non-essential business more or less on hold while we figure out what the future looks like in terms of our boards and commissions and their structures.
Thank you.
Commissioner Landris.
So I just would like to understand, as far as the ARB is concerned, when council voted on May 5th with respect to the staff restructuring recommendations, is it accurate to say that that was a budget vote only and not a policy vote? So as far as we are concerned, as of today, the ARB exists and will continue to exist until further notice? Or should we be considering otherwise?
The ARB will exist in some form. We don't know yet exactly what that will be, Sean.
Right.
It may. One of the things we're talking very seriously about is converting their role to an advisory role. We still very much want to be able to tap into the expertise that the ARB brings and what the board members offer. But if we could do that in a more efficient way, both in terms of their time and our time, that's what we're trying to do. So the way it's envisioned now and what we will be recommending is that that ARB becomes advisory and that they are definitely involved in larger projects, and they would advise the Planning Commission in terms of what design issues should be considered when you review a project, for example. That's kind of the way we're thinking, but again, nothing has been figured out entirely and set in stone yet, but that's definitely the way we're thinking.
Okay. That's a whole other conversation I didn't want to open up here. I just wanted to
It's really
clarify
not-
the difference between the budget and what you were saying in terms of the function of those boards. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Reese.
Sean just asked my question, so I'm good. Thank you.
Commissioner Pastor.
What time are we meeting on the 3rd? Are we continuing with these 5:30 meetings, or are we going back to 7 p.m.?
So far, we're continuing with 5:30 unless the commission would like to change that time. We've indicated that that's flexible with respect to the commission, but it is at 5:30.
I have one final question. What's the date the City Council is actually considering the budget? Anyone know?
It's in June. I have to look at a calendar.
June 5th.
June 5th? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Nita.
No, it's
Okay, we have no minutes. We have no STOAs. We have number 8A, the consent calendar regarding a vesting tentative track map at 2425 20th Street. Are there ex parte, I'm going to go down the line, Sean. Communications, and start with Commissioner Fonda Bernardi. Just yes or no, and if yes, what?
I said I had no communications ex parte.
Okay. Thank you. Commissioner Fresco.
No.
Commissioner Andrus.
Yes, I had a text message from Thomas Malayle telling me that he was near the project site and that he would be sending a letter to us, and I gather he did, and it was included in our public comment packet.
Yeah, we actually have to pull this because there was a public comment after 12. Commissioner McKinnon.
No.
Commissioner Pastor,
No.
Commissioner Reese.
No.
Can I ask staff to confirm whether there was public comment after noon that needs to be read into the record?
Yes, we have one comment.
Okay, I've talked to the applicant who's comfortable not speaking, and I don't think we need a staff report, so why don't we have the public comment now?
Okay. Dear Mr. Furman, as
Do we have to make a
neighbor
motion to pull it off consent? Folks?
Well, it's public comment on a consent item. We can still hear the public comment and then decide whether or not we want to pull it from
No, you have
consent.
to pull it off consent to hear the comment. Okay, so let's just
So
go. What's the public
moved.
comment? Second,
Okay.
all in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Can we have the public comment read?
Dear Mr. Furman, as a neighbor on 21st Street of the proposed project, I would like to ask for the following. 1. That Empire Associates LLC show proof of the permit to cut the tree in the front of the property. 2. Not to issue the permit for the plans in their present form. Low-density residential zoning means low density. An underground garage in the alley adds additional traffic of approximately 6 cars or more. Plus, where is there room for their garbage containers? There is the already existing huge problem with garbage areas. The rental properties on the west side of the alley between 20th and 21st Streets already have no room for their garbage cans and dump everything on the east side of the alley on the properties of the residential houses. Complaints to the city have not brought about any solutions so far. Thank you for your time. Signed, D. Horkert.
Okay, tonight I have it confirmed by staff that really the only item that we're considering tonight is a tentative tract map. It's not a design review permit. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's just for the vesting tentative parcel map.
Okay, do we have a motion or commission discussion? Hello?
I'll move the
I
motion.
move
Okay, moved by Fonda Bernardi and seconded by Fresco. Any discussion? Let's have a roll call vote.
I have a question.
Commissioner
Let me just
Lambert.
ask. Thank you. I just have a question of staff, which is there anything in the tract map that is germane to the public comments that have been received with respect to the tract map for underground parking or for garbage placement? I don't see it, so I don't see an issue. But I just want to clarify that there is in fact
Josh, can you
not.
clarify that, please?
Sure. The track map does show the access from the alley to the subterranean parking, but as far as the trash room, that hasn't been addressed yet because we don't have an actual building to look at yet. But that will be required to be on site.
But it's not part of the tract map. It's not an
Right,
item
so-
that we consider.
I understand that. I'm just a little bit confused looking at the plans, just so I understand where that parking, to which parcel does the parking apply? Where, if we're doing a tract map, who owns the parking where? That's what I'm just not clear on.
I mean, the track map is essentially just an air right subdivision, so they can sell the condos individually. The
Okay.
underground parking will be more of a shared space, and 2 parking spaces will be attributed to each of those 3 units.
I
And that
see.
has nothing to do with the tract map.
Thank you. That's the clarification that I'm looking for.
Okay, can we have a roll
It'll be a
call vote,
shared
please?
responsibility. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. So it'll be the HOA's responsibility. Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi,
Yes.
Commissioner Fresco,
yes.
Commissioner Landry,
Yes.
Commissioner Landris, Commissioner McKinnon,
Yes.
I know.
Commissioner Pastor,
Yes.
Commissioner Reese,
Yes.
and Chair Lambert.
Yes. So that brings us to what we've all been waiting for.
Chair Lambert, could I just jump in and make a correction? So the budget study session with the City Council is on June 9th.
Oh, great, thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure.
Let me again announce that item 9B, the Carlthorpe School item is not on tonight. It's been pulled and will be heard at a future date. Any of those watching, that's what's going on. So item 9A, which is proposed amendments to the downtown community plan and the zoning ordinance regarding Tier 3 housing projects downtown. Could we, we have staff report, please?
Sure. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Good evening, Commission. Steve Mizukami from City Planning. Allow me to share my screen with everybody. Okay, so the next item on the agenda are recommendations to amend the Downtown Community Plan and Zoning Ordinance. Last Wednesday on May 13th, the Commission moved forward two resolutions of intention, to consider recommendations to the City Council as identified on this slide. The proposed amendments to the DCP include Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet to be reviewed through a development review permit, text revisions to the definition of a housing project, clerical amendments to Chapter 2A.4, which is the DCP entitlement and tier system, and amendments to the zoning ordinance to establish project requirements for Tier 3 downtown housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet. So I do want to touch briefly on prior housing discussions both the Commission and Council have had over the last 6 months. On December 10th, the City Council held a study session regarding housing policy, and this was in response to state and regional directives regarding the increase of housing production for Santa Monica, where it was initially commented to consider the elimination of development agreements. On January 15th, the Commission adopted an ROI to consider amending the definition of housing project as defined in the DCP, which will be discussed this evening. On March 10th, the City Council adopted an emergency IZO authorizing affordable housing projects and HAA compliant projects to be reviewed through an administrative approval process. It was also discussed at that meeting that development agreements be eliminated for Tier 3 housing projects in the downtown, consistent with efforts in streamlining the review of housing projects. So the DCP establishes 3 application review procedures for projects consisting of administrative approvals, development review permits, and development agreements. Application review thresholds are based on the project type, the tier level, as well as the amount of proposed square footage in a project. The Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet currently require the approval of a development agreement, as shown on this slide. So as we know, the City has processed development agreements to negotiate various aspects of projects, including community benefits on a project-by-project basis, which has been successful in meeting the goals of the loops. And while the primary community benefit for residential DAs being affordable housing, the DCP contains the most aggressive affordable housing requirements throughout the city. And elimination of development agreement review for these projects could be considered, given this change would only apply to housing projects in the transit adjacent zone, and also given the city's need to increase its overall housing production. In comparison, review through a development review permit offers greater predictability in both review process and requirements for applicants, while also decreasing overall project costs. So consistent with the Council's effort to maximize opportunities for housing, it would be appropriate to consider changes that would help incentivize housing development. The proposed amendments are intended to support housing production through process incentives and design flexibility for Tier 3 housing projects. Amendment 1, Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet to be reviewed through a development review permit. This amendment would only affect properties within the transit adjacent district, as Tier 3 housing projects are only permissible in this district within the downtown area. This would not result in any changes to the downtown district development standards, such as building height and floor area ratio. And then also the established large sites requirements identified in the DCP would also not be altered. So although 27 parcels in the district would be affected, the number of properties would be less based on parcels either being recently developed or entitled that they would likely not be pursuing large housing projects. The next amendment would revise the housing project definition to allow up to 33% of the total building square footage to be non-residential floor area. And then also to remove the limitation that restricts the location of that area to the first floor. Amending the housing project definition in the DCP consistent with the HAA definition would help to improve financial feasibility and as well as additional flexibility in developing mixed-use housing projects. Moving on to Amendment 3, clerical amendments to the language within Chapter 2A.4, outlining the development agreement review procedures is needed for consistency. For Amendment 4 to the zoning ordinance, Chapter 9.10, downtown districts, would establish project requirements for Tier 3 downtown housing projects greater than 75,000 square feet. Specifically, this section establishes project requirements for Tier 2 and Tier 3 housing and mixed-use residential projects up to 90,000 square feet in the form of prescriptive community benefits in each of the following categories as shown here. This includes affordable housing in the unit mix, additional developer impact fees related to open space and transportation, as well as affordable housing mitigation fees for commercial and transportation demand management measurements. Now these requirements would remain unchanged. The proposed amendments to this section include revising the applicability of these requirements to all Tier 2 and Tier 3 projects and would provide consistency in those requirements for all housing projects exceeding the Tier 1 thresholds. This change is intended to incentivize Tier 3 housing projects, and that these requirements would be, as mentioned, prescriptive and no longer determined through the DA means, providing greater predictability while decreasing overall project costs. During the ROI discussion last week, the Commission requested more information regarding the ARB's role moving forward. As we know, the ARB in its current form is proposed to be replaced with an alternate design review process. And while decisions have not been made nor authorized by Council, City staff anticipates that the ARB will still be involved with the review of larger new development. In summary, the proposed amendments support housing production through process initiatives and design flexibility for those Tier 3 housing projects. And they're consistent with the loose policies that seek to expand housing opportunities near transit-rich districts, including near the downtown Expo Station. Staff recommends that the Planning Commission adopt the resolutions recommending to the City Council the amendments as provided in both attachments A and B of the staff report. And staff is available for any questions. We do have a few diagrams and maps that we pulled out from the staff report for visual aids if we need.
Thank you, Steve. That was an excellent staff report. I'm going to have commissioners ask questions first and then take the public comment. And the reason I'm doing that is it gives people more time if they wish to email us with their comments. If you wish to comment on this item and you're a member of the public, you email to planningcomment@smgov.net, and staff will read your comment when it comes in. So let's start with staff questioning with Commissioner Fonda Bernardi.
Yeah, Steve, thank you. That was an excellent report. What do you think the impact is of using 1/3 of the floor area for commercial will be on housing production? Is that a high number, a low number? Where do you think how's that gonna play out in your mind?
I think currently right now when we have the limitation of 25%, what it could do is if it does increase the amount of commercial square footage in a project, perhaps maybe that might help to offset either the units that are sitting above it or even the affordable number of affordable units that are in the project as well. So, it's from 25 to 33. It's not a great jump, but it does align up with the HAA definition. So at least there's consistency there. But in terms of that, of course, the other revision is to not restrict it on the first floor, just to provide some flexibility. And I think that kind of speaks later on to the project as property owners are trying to find tenants and find creative ways to get certain tenants in there. So,
yeah, I agree with the flexibility of where you place it on the project site or on which floor you place it for a variety of reasons. But I'm not sure reducing the percentage of housing that is allowed is going to help us. I'm just asking that question. How do you think it's going to really help us?
Well, I think when we're thinking about these types of changes, we're obviously trying to balance a lot of things here. We're at one point trying to encourage housing projects to be developed, and at the same
when you're rounding fractional units, you always round up, and that the developer can choose what level of affordability they want that rounded up unit to be. And I was asking Steve if we shouldn't narrow what the choices were to incentivize the more moderate income units that we're really short on right now. And Steve, you said that that wasn't something that was proposed for this revision, but project requirements and amounts of affordable do seem to be proposed for this revision in your staff report. So is that something we can discuss as a commission going forward? Is that Leslie's shaking her head no, why not?
Because I think that would take another ROI to amend the zoning code to change that. That's part of the inclusionary requirements for downtown for all projects. I mean, I'm not averse to that, but I don't think
the language is in the document here, but we would have to change it in the zoning also. Is that what you're saying? And so we can't change it here until we do it all. Is that?
Jane, do you want to respond?
Can somebody help? I want to know what.
Certainly, I think what we have found actually for projects that have gone through is that most people will gravitate towards the moderate given the option. The percentages that are in there right now are aligning with the city's current 5th cycle RENA, in terms of getting those units. So we are okay on our, reporting cycle right now. Looking forward, I wouldn't want to do a sort of knee-jerk reaction to this because we are just in the process of updating our housing element over the next year or so, and that would be the opportunity to look back at this stuff holistically as opposed to chipping away at it piecemeal. So, our recommendation at this point is to, retain what has already existed and agreed upon in the DCP, and then as part of the housing element update, we would have to look at that collectively in terms of running feasibility analyses and what have you, because we have so many different factors in play with respect to housing production.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Landris.
Yes, just to clarify, following up on Commissioner Fresco's question, and this is separate from whether we should, but whether we can, page 9 of the staff report, which does have the language, and it's page 9, looks like section 3, the last sentence in that paragraph, this is page 28 of the PDF packet and page 9 of the staff report, states the resulting whole units may be provided at 30%, 50%, 80%, or moderate income household affordability level. So I just want to clarify whether or not you think we should. It's certainly within the Commission's purview within this red line to redline that sentence if we so chose. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. That is before the Commission.
Okay.
That's
What
where
exactly are you saying?
If I may make,
I don't want to. No, I'm not. I'm actually going to keep asking my questions. I just wanted to clarify that text was before us for review. I'm not. We're not in discussion yet. I just wanted to clarify that. Steve, we continue to get. First of all, thank you for that excellent report, and we continue to receive public comment. I have two questions. One is we continue to receive public comment, which seems to be under the misapprehension that moving from a development agreement to a development review permit would eliminate public participation in review of proposed large projects. Could you clarify that that is in fact not the case?
Mm-hmm. Sure. So when we're so the proposal would bring all of those projects that would be development agreements down to the development review permit. With the development review permit, those are public hearings, and those are discretionary applications, and which require discretionary approvals. So just the change from the DA to the DER would not eliminate public process. We would still have our regular planning commission meetings. It's just the process of the type of the application changes, but it still will come before the planning commission for consideration versus a development agreement, which would also still have that public process to it. And then, of course, as we had talked about earlier, this DR projects and potentially larger projects would still have some form of ARB consideration as we're thinking about different ways how the ARB is going to inform us.
I'm going to interrupt you right now. I'm going to interrupt you, Sean. Heidi wants to speak.
Okay.
Just briefly, actually, I can defer to Jing if she wants to hop in. I do want to clarify that what is before you based on the scope of your ROI and based on the noticing is just projects that exceed 90,000 square feet. So to the extent you want to alter project requirements, although it reads, the staff recommendation is to treat, because the standards were already set forth for tier 2 projects that are less than 90,000 square, tier 3 projects less than 90,000 square feet. So what you're actually, the scope of would be only those projects that exceed 90,000 square feet. So I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page with respect to scope.
Thank you. Thank you. I totally get that. Okay, so Steve, thank you for clarifying that. Now, am I correct that a development agreement is a legislative process, whereas a development review permit is a quasi-judicial process. Is that correct? So,
Yeah, correct.
okay, forgive me. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding here, and I want to get some clarifications on the record for folks who are watching. Am I correct that under the legislative process, there are any number of meetings that can take place, just like for any other ordinance, and no disclosure of those meetings is required other than what might be registered by be reported by a registered lobbyist, but other than that, lots of private conversations can take place around DAs without having any formal disclosure. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I'll let Heidi chime in if I'm incorrect, but I believe
Okay,
that's correct.
Is that correct, Heidi?
Yes, that's correct. With a legislative act, the bias and ex parte rules do not apply because it ends with the adoption of an ordinance.
And if we were to have under development review permits, however, any conversation had by any member of the ARB, the Planning Commission, the City Council, with an applicant, with anyone with any interest in the process, would have to be reported and also would be subject to California conflict of interest and economic interest provisions. Is that correct?
Yes, although a DA would still be subject to conflict of interest provisions and economic interest provisions, but the ex parte rules and the bias and the prejudgment rules, those are different for quasi-judicial acts than they are for legislative acts.
So it would be fair to say that there's an argument that could be made that, in fact, a development review permit is a more transparent process reviewing projects than a DA, because the public is entitled to far more information about the engagement of decision makers in that process than it would be under a DA. Is that a fair statement?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily be able to place a value judgment on it, but you are correct that in terms of those disclosures, those are mandated, and they are not mandated with a development agreement. That's
okay.
John, I think you're getting
Thank
into
you.
the discussion.
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you.
Commissioner McKinnon.
Number one, anybody who addresses the Planning Commission tonight, can you turn your camera on, please? I think it's only fair that when you talk to us that the camera's on. So, first question to David Martin. I'd like to follow up on the ARB issue. We had to talk about this yesterday and I emailed you. Could you tell us that there will be some form of public process around design review and outline what you believe it will look like, accepting that it has not yet gone to council?
Certainly. So, as we discussed a little bit earlier, what we envision would be a advisory role for the Architectural Review Board. So there will still be a public process where the board would review would review projects and then provide a recommendation to the Planning Commission, for example, on large projects. So that's what we are planning to recommend. As you mentioned, nothing's been approved yet, so we can't exactly describe the process, but we definitely anticipate that there will be a design review process for larger projects, that the ARB will remain in some form, and that they will take on an advisory role. So that's the recommendation at this point.
So that if tonight the process has changed and there is streamlining on Tier 3 projects, quite large projects, there will still remain a public process around design and a public process of assessing the project through the DRP at the Planning Commission.
That's correct.
Thank you. My next set of questions go, I guess, to Jing. Looking at the overall planning issues, we've had a number of comments come to us backwards and forwards about the role of DRPs versus DAs. The DRP that the Planning Commission approves can be appealed to Council, correct?
That's right, yep.
So there still remains Council decision-making in this, should there be enough angst or concern either way by the public. The Council can still weigh in.
Right, if it is appealable to the council, that's right.
Correct. Now, with the DRP, what we're essentially suggesting is that these project sites can go to a higher height limit, but there still remains FAR limits, and there still remains setback limits. There still remains all the other features of the downtown community plan that govern what can be built, to what extent it can be built, and every other condition that we put on every other building in the city. It's not as if there's suddenly a removal of all the context of the downtown community plan.
Yeah, and again, we want to be clear that there are no development standards being changed here. This is a procedural amendment. This is just about how to process projects. The height and the FAR that was already established and approved in the DCP, and none of that is changing.
I am correct that we have, for buildings that are 84 feet high under DRPs, a 30% affordability position.
No,
yeah, we do.
I'm sorry. Are you saying there are now? Or no, we have. So what we do have actually is, I think we also need to clarify that within the DCP, this is the current rules, is that there are classes of tier 3 projects, that are, if you're less than 75,000 square feet, you actually are processed, those projects are processed already through an administrative approval. So it was like a scaled process thresholds table, that is in the DCP. So it was agreed upon that, it's about the size of these projects. So it was projects up to 75,000 square feet, regardless of the tier, are processed through administrative approval. And then it's sort of split apart between tier 2 and tier 3 within that development review permit realm. So all tier 2 projects above 75,000, regardless of their size, go through a DR process. And then the tier 3 projects between 75 and 90,000 are in that DR. And then the tier 3s above 90,000 have, go through that development agreement process. So this proposal is about moving the tier 3 above 90,000 into that DR realm.
So what would the levels of affordability be?
For an 84-foot?
Yes.
Yeah, it'd be 30%.
I think that was the question I was asking, which would be substantially more than we've received on almost any other project city to this date, correct?
That would be correct, yeah.
Yeah, so the removal of this cap, if someone chose to build on it, they would find that they're getting a higher level of affordability imposed on them.
That's correct, yeah.
Right. We, on January the 15th, moved to bring the definition of housing back, and it's now come back. There are changes that are being forced on us by state legislation to conform to the Housing Affordability Act. Are they the commercial changes, size of the commercial inside a project, and there are two of them, right?
Right. So, yeah, the only change with so this is the housing definition, the DCP housing definition. It's by no means being mandated by the state. This is a choice the city has. The city can establish, whatever definition you want to call a housing project. The proposal here was just to align with what the state, because the state does define what a housing project is. I will say that the original DCP definition was pulled from the HAA that was, in effect at the time. And it was actually a mashup of the Housing Accountability Act and the CEQA exemptions. However, since that time, the HAA definition of a housing project has evolved to include this 33% allowance in terms of non-residential floor area. So it seemed, and then looking at, since the DCP has been adopted, using CEQA as a limit in terms of using that as a reference point for what is a cap on commercial space and what we would call a housing project doesn't really make sense anymore because we have the DCP EIR to rely upon. So that's why the proposal before you is just to align with the state's definition of a housing project. However, again, it is a policy decision of the city. We certainly are not required to do that.
So both that decision, 25 going to 33, and also the placement of commercial in a building, or the removal where commercial has to be placed, what do you think the impact of that will be?
Increasing the 25 to the 33%.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's interesting. It depends on the project applicant. I will say that even though that option is there, it doesn't mean that people necessarily pursue it, because we see that even the housing definition, the current housing definition of 25%, we'd be hard pressed to say that a quarter of the floor area in the housing projects we've seen in downtown have been devoted to commercial, because that's not how they finance the project. And what this allows is, in some of these other sites, you know, there may be the opportunity for someone to put, you know, a second floor non-residential use of some kind, you know, that activates it, or as a service for those residents, or what have you. I'd be speculating at that point, but it's interesting. You know, we haven't seen projects thus far that have maximized that non-residential floor area. You know, so I think it's you know, hard for us to say that the market is really responding to that. So as to what the effect would be, it gives the opportunity, you know, to pursue that. But whether they will, I think is going to be a question on the unique aspects of a site, you know, versus and the size of a site and what kind of project they're pursuing. So.
Thank you. And I'll ask my last question of Steve. Steve, you've identified 27 parcels which potentially have development opportunities under this proposal. As you walked around the city looking at them, how many of those in reality are likely to be developed, given that a number of them have got buildings on them, which would take up most of the developable possibility?
Right.
I mean, are we talking
Let me go ahead.
2 sites, 5 sites, 10 sites?
Sure. I'm going to share my screen really quickly because we do have the table that's in the staff report, and that might kind of help provide a little bit of context here.
Could you make that larger? Thank you.
Yes.
Can you put that into slideshow view by any chance, so that we don't have to?
Oh, yeah.
That'll make it even bigger.
Sure, definitely.
It's also on the staff report.
Not everyone at home has the staff report.
So as the staff report mentions, even though there's technically 27 parcels, the table that we put together kind of starts to show how many parcels might be within kind of what is seen as kind of a property. For example, probably the easiest one is Santa Monica Place, where there's 5 parcels, but of course we see that as one property. We start to take a look at this list. You know, it's going to be definitely less than 27. We do have quite a few of properties that have recently developed. You see a lot of the mixed-use residential projects ranging from anywhere from 2001 to 2007, 15. Some are in construction. We do have 2 of the sites, which are the hotel sites that are developed. So you start to go down in numbers, but you do have a few of the parcels, properties that have some older development. You have the U.S. Postal Service. Of course, you have the Big Blue Bus Yards. The former Fred Siegel site currently has an entitlement for the Target, but of course that is, you know, an adaptive reuse. You have the Sears property that is under construction for their adaptive reuse, so it's likely not anytime soon that that would happen. But you do have a few other properties. Let's see here, 402 Colorado, for example, you have the metro station and some parcels in and around that area that could potentially redevelop. And of course, you have the backside of the 710 Broadway, which is the rear side of where the Vons retail stores.
So it's your contention it's not one site, there's a handful of sites, but it's not a large number.
Correct.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm finished, Chair.
You done?
Yes, thank you for the time.
Commissioner Pastor. You're muted.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, staff, for the staff report. It's very helpful. I have two questions. One, I guess, is for Steve. So if you have a project today that is over 90,000 square feet, is it processed with both a DRP and a development agreement, or just a development agreement?
So so currently right now it would be going based on what the current review procedures are at the time of the application. So let's say, for example, moving forward, these amendments are approved by council and they become new. An existing application could elect to go under the new review procedures. However,
I'm going to stop
they would be
because I think you misunderstood my question.
Sorry.
So, like, let's say this doesn't get adopted, or what the current process that a project over 90,000 square feet needs both a DRP and a DA, or does it just need a DA?
It just needs a development agreement.
Okay. And then my question for Heidi, which is something that relates to the Housing Accountability Act, so that I want everyone to hear. So today, are projects that meet the definition of a housing project under the HAA subject to the protections of the HAA?
Yes.
So that means that we couldn't have more than 5 hearings on a project. That means we couldn't impose a bunch of things on the project that made it infeasible or made the housing infeasible. So we are still limited whether or not there's a development agreement in place, the HAA.
Right. So there do not appear to be any carve-outs for development projects that are approved via development agreement rather than an entitlement, like a development review permit.
Okay.
It's not really something that comes up very often, because usually development agreements have projects that kind of exceed a zoning ordinance requirement, so the two don't usually intersect, where you're meeting all of the objectives, standards, and moving forward like that.
Okay. But if a project came in with a development agreement that met the standards, we would be subject to the same strictures that we have now.
It appears that way, yes.
Okay. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Reese.
Thank you. Thanks, staff, for the presentation. Couple of quick questions. For Steve first, on your figure 1 of transit adjacent district, didn't we work on an 84-foot tall building right at the corner of 6th and Colorado that has an entitlement? It most likely won't go through a new entitlement. So I think there's another site that should be turned beige on your map.
Are we talking about would that be the north, I guess the northeast corner of 5th and Broadway?
Yeah, I will call it the old Frito Misto site. But yeah, I think that's it.
Site. Oh, okay. So the Frito Misto site, let's see here. I think based on the availability of being able to get the 90,000 square feet, I think that's where maybe that property may not be included in the diagram. Let me see if I can pull that up really quickly.
Yeah, just confirming that. So this map is for sites 22,005 and over, right? That was because
Correct,
we were asked to isolate which sites could achieve more than 90,000 square feet. So because the maximum FAR is 4.0, tier 3, so the map says the site has to be at least that size, and that particular property was smaller than that.
Okay, thank you. Misunderstood that. do we have the authority, if we wanted in this situation, if we went through with this, to, I mean, because what I think I'm hearing is and maybe this is a question for staff, is if we're losing the ARB, what I'm hearing from staff is that we'll have input from the ARB, but it won't be a formal hearing. Is that an accurate understanding?
Yes, that is correct. I think we're considering, basically having like an advisory committee to the Planning Commission. So it doesn't mean there's no public hearing, because it would still need to have a Planning Commission public hearing, and that design meeting would still be a public meeting, that people could attend. But like David said, we're just reassessing the role and, trying to come up with a process that still meets all the goals, that everyone knows and is used to about design review, but just in a way that is less labor intensive,
Okay,
both on staff resources.
So that leads me to the question of do we have the ability in a DRP for projects over this square footage to add in a hearing, like a float up, to get an initial review?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you have now. All development review permit projects. No, do you mean for design or just as a general?
I'm talking about just a DRP that comes through as opposed to a development agreement. My understanding is we have the float ups with development agreements, and the DRP doesn't have that.
So I think my question to you would be to think about what you would like to discuss in that float up. Because if it's to, because the commission is ultimately making a decision on that, we've been cautious about having, sort of pre-reviews or preliminary reviews, for a permit that you're going to view later. So, I think that if there was interest in doing that kind of a process, probably clearly understanding the goal of that float up, a DR float up review or what have you. As I was indicating, right now the process does require a preliminary review by the ARB for design, which is then input to the Planning Commission. But in terms of what you would be looking for in this realm, which is housing projects, what the commission would want to accomplish in that early review.
Okay, so I didn't hear, no, you can't do it. It's just, let's talk about if there's value in doing that.
I think that it depends on what you'd like to do, and then we could probably think about whether that process would be appropriate.
Okay, and then my bigger question is, I wasn't on the commission when we did the DCP, but ever since I've been approved, I've heard the biggest problem with it is the level of affordability. And, are we creating a lot of controversy right now, but not addressing the most important piece of this puzzle, which is the affordability level of 30%?
Yes.
I think that's a policy question, for the commission to tackle. We didn't, right now, like I said, these are procedural changes. We were not proposing changing those at the moment. Again, that is something that will be assessed as part of the housing element update. That's something that council, had included in their direction in terms of how to incentivize housing production. And I know for sure there was interest in, revisiting the requirements in the downtown.
Okay, I'm going to hold any other questions I might have. Thank you.
Thank you. I have a couple questions. Two of Heidi. Commissioner Pastor brought up the 5 hearing maximum for housing projects covered by the Housing Accountability Act. Are there any sanctions if you go beyond that 5 hearing limit?
Right. So first of all, I should clarify and also apologize to Commissioner Pastor. I was actually more thinking in terms of the protections of whether or not you could reduce the density or deny a project under the Housing Accountability Act if it meets all the objective standards. I hadn't actually thought through the 5 hearing because there really is a statutory provision that sets forth how to how to do development agreements, which we have incorporated into our municipal code and also modified slightly. I don't think that there generally are more than 5 hearings by the time you actually mandated 5 hearings by the time you actually get to the end. In terms of another interesting piece about that is that to your question about the 5 hearings and whether or not there are sanctions, that's actually tied to the Permit Streamlining Act, which is not generally applicable to development agreements because they're not entitlements. They are, part of the legislative process. So that is perhaps a question that we could look into a little bit more carefully for you. And again, I do apologize to Commissioner Pastor for not answering her question more fully.
The other question I had is, and I know this from experience, I think I know the answer. We can have a DRP public hearing, and we can keep that public hearing open for however long, and that still counts as one hearing, correct?
Yes, but under the SB 330 streamlining, a continued hearing would count as an additional hearing.
Oh, really? Well, that's interesting.
Yes.
Even though it's a continued hearing. That's interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. The other question I have is of Steve. We've been talking about the TA district, but next door is the Gateway Master Plan area. My understanding is that if there's not a Gateway plan adopted before January 1st of next year, and there certainly won't be, it then gets all the zoning, the development standards of the transit adjacent district. Is that correct?
Correct.
So the metro site, which is just south of the expo station, which is large enough for a tier 3, according to you, would then have the tier 3 development standards that are now in the transit adjacent district as of January, right?
Correct.
Okay, and then there are a number of parcels throughout the PA district that are smaller than 22,500. We don't have any way of knowing, and I know this, do we, of whether or not some of those could be aggregated in the future to actually create a site large enough for a tier 3 project. We don't know the answer to that, do we?
That's correct. Yeah, we wouldn't know, based on what property owners would want to do and how they would.
Right.
Yeah.
So we're sort of locking this in time now as to what is 22.5, but something else could. Okay.
Yeah, correct.
And then the other question I have, and I don't really, frankly, expect anyone to have the answer to this, but I want to get it soon. When Paul Silverman did his inclusionary housing program analysis 3.5 years ago, did he account for holding costs? Meaning, if we could take 1 year to process a housing project or 10 years, would that have any effect on his conclusions? Does anyone know the answer to that?
I'm going off the top of my head, but again, that the analyses are a point in time.
Their point in time. So processing
yeah.
time had no impact on the economics of the project, which is okay. But,
No.
So we had no way of knowing whether streamlining would make it more profitable. I mean, obviously it would, but we had no way of knowing that.
No, it's a basic approach. I think that he's explained several times. Yeah, that it's a point in time analysis.
Right. It certainly is a point in time. And I want to second what Commissioner Reese said, that I have believed for a long time that it's time to revisit the inclusionary program downtown, because in my opinion it does not work. We have seen no inclusionary projects come in at the top level of the scale since it was adopted, and I don't think it works. But that's personal, and I think at some point in the future we'll be looking at that. Okay, so let's hear from
I have a follow-up. I'm sorry, I have a follow-up.
Wait. Commissioner McKinnon.
Thank you. My question is to Jing. So Jing, it is in the report. Could you outline the average length of time for a DA and the average length of time for a DRP?
It's probably difference of years and months.
So are we talking 2.5 years to 3 years for a DA? I mean, some of those DAs for the big sites are 10 and 12 years, but the average DA that comes in, is that a 3-year process as opposed to 6 months with a DRP?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a DA for a housing project, they tend to be a little more straightforward. That's probably accurate, about that three-ish years. For the same, code compliant housing project, you're looking at something like the 6 months ish.
The same building, we cut 2.5 years off the process.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Landris.
So I just wanted to follow. I'm confused, so I just want to kind of try to get unconfused. we have the DA process, we have the DRP process, we have the Housing Accountability Act. Right now, if a project came in that was subject to a DA but was compliant with the Housing Accountability Act, would it be subject to a 5-hearing limit?
Right. So I think that's the question that we probably would need to ensure. This is a very new law, right? So, and again, there is a set process. It's a statutory process for development agreements. It's set forth in the government code. It allows you to adopt it. We have adopted an ordinance that's actually outside of the zoning ordinance, but in Article 9 that sets forth the process for a development agreement process, right?
Okay.
So, you know, as I mentioned, I was more looking at whether or not if it met all the objective standards, what sort of, if there were protections for that project. I honestly, I will try to do some looking right now to see if I can get you some more clarity on the 5-hearing issue. But I was, you know, we haven't actually sorted that through that piece yet.
Got it. Okay. So right now, either there's a 5-hearing limit or there isn't for HAA compliant project. For non-HAA compliant projects, there is no limit. And that is true for both DAs and DRs, correct? Okay. So if we move to a DR, and if we move to DR, then we would have a statutory process that for the time being, until there's a revision, includes an ARB meeting, a planning commission meeting, and potentially a council appeal on any given project. So the minimum number of hearings at the current time would be 3 meetings. Is that right?
Yes.
Well, I don't know that under the SB 330 rules that the appeal hearing would necessarily count towards it because it's to get you to a project approval. So if you get to a project approval, you know, kind of like with the Permit Streamlining Act, an appeal is after that time period. Does that make sense?
So what I'm trying, right, I do understand that. I guess what I'm trying to understand is because when we went down this road, then the question came up of float-ups or Tier 3s. And I'm wondering whether or not you anticipate what the impact of SB 330 and the Permit Streamlining Act are on float-ups.
Well, if I could actually redirect that question a little bit to piggyback on earlier comments that Jing made, our office would have concerns about the scope of what a float-up would look like on an entitlement. So concept hearings on design review are kind of one thing. But in terms of, as we were talking about earlier, in terms of when a quasi-judicial process is unfolding, there are obviously concerns about prejudgment and bias. So what you would be looking at as a concept review would probably enter us into some risk in that regard. So I think we would want to understand what the value was of that project, of that float-up hearing, where it is in the process, what it would look like, and whether or not that value is outweighed by the risks involved with the prejudgment and bias issues.
Understood. And then this is my last question because I'm just trying to kind of map out the differences in the process. Right now, if I'm understanding correctly, projects that come to the Planning Commission frequently they have had some sort of ARB float-up because frequently we get some feedback from ARB. Then they come to us, and then we go ahead and give direction to ARB to look at some other stuff. So,
Steve can answer that question, but that is a code requirement to have the ARB float up on development review permits prior to.
But that means we're now at a minimum of 3 hearings for a DR, plus, depending on whether you think it's a approval, a 4th meeting if there's a council appeal. Is that right? So I guess what I'm getting at is we are already very close to the edge of hitting SB 330 limits because if any one of those meetings is continued, we've just doubled the number. Is that right?
Can we stop right now?
I'm just trying to understand. I'm trying to understand.
There are no sanctions if you exceed 5 hearings.
I thought the project was deemed approved.
No.
Heidi?
It refers you back to the Permit Streamlining Act, which requires that whole noticing process and an opportunity to have it approved during a public hearing. So it kind of floats you back into the remedies under the Permit Streamlining Act.
You know, Frank,
So
let me just stop here.
Okay.
I don't really care if it takes 5 hearings or 10 hearings or 12 hearings. The point is a DRP takes a year and a DA takes 3 years. So for me, that's the overriding consideration.
I understand that that's the overriding consideration for you. I'm trying to understand. We went down a little bit of a garden path, and I'm just trying to get apples to apples here. And I think what I'm understanding is we are heading into a streamlining world, whether or not we make this change because of the new requirements of SB 330 and permit streamlining. We have an opportunity. And the changes that we are being asked to consider tonight do not substantially limit the level of public comment or public participation
Right.
that is reviewed. Is that
I think we've made that point.
okay?
That the DRP is definitely a public.
I'm just trying to line up these processes. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So can we hear from the public? Can somebody read the comments? I'm sure there are a lot of them.
Yes. So far, we do have 12 comments. So I'm not sure if you guys wanted to vote on the time limit on that, or do we want to stick to 3 minutes for each?
Well, I certainly don't want more than 3 minutes. How do other people feel?
Are these comments that have been submitted into the record that we have read? So
No.
they're
new.
or are these comments that
These
are post-noon?
These are all post-noon. A handful of them may have gone to your SM.gov accounts, but most of them have not.
Why don't we limit it to 3 minutes? Does that sound good to people? Or do you want 2 minutes?
Last time yeah.
Three's fine. Let's
3 minutes.
let's read them. She's just reading them. So
Let's read them. Let's just read them.
Okay.
Yep. Let's just read them.
Well, but I want a limit. I mean, I don't want to, spend 10 minutes.
3 minutes.
3
I think
minutes.
3 minutes is
Okay, 2
fine.
minutes.
3 minutes.
Okay. First one is from Elizabeth Van Denberg, Wilmot Chair and Audit Subcommittee member representing her views only. Santa Monica Planning Commissioners, I continue to oppose approving and submitting Agenda Item 9A to City Council, i.e. changing DCP housing projects of greater than 90,000 square feet from a DA to a DR. I outline my continued opposition in this letter below. If you move this resolution forward tonight, the following project requirements should be required for transit-adjacent Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet. Number 1, Architectural Review Board. A volunteer board of local professionals be retained and continue to review these projects based on their professional and technical skills not available from city. These are large projects that will be part of and impact the city for a century. We should use the ARB input. Number 2, as well, establish a process for public notification, comment, and design review on all TA Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet. Local input to these large projects will create better output, really. Number 3, the staff report outlines the incentives for this process, i.e. community benefit requirements would be prescriptive and no longer determined through DA negotiations. Work to ensure that the translated DR fees, which are based on Tier 1 fee requirements, Tier 1 floor area times base fees plus Tier 2 fee requirements, Tier 2 floor area times additional fees, are recalculated to identify appropriate prescriptive fees with respect to Tier 3 floor area and any additional fees that are considered in any DA negotiation. Number 4, address the need for additional fees for these large projects and their ongoing and long-term cost impact on the city, given they will be housing and commercial functions which are deficit creating, i.e. they generate more costs than revenue in the general fund. These projects drain the general fund, and the city should determine how these costs will be covered in the long term. Number 5, project requirements must specify that all these projects at a minimum must meet Proposition R affordable housing requirements and for people at or below 80% of Los Angeles median income. Let us be specific about the economic level we want to help and make each of these projects responsible and accountable to those requirements. Number 6, direct all monies identified from these TA Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet are recorded and transparent via city's financial portal to a fund/reporting entity and is specified only for use for 1, primarily for residents serving essential services like libraries, code enforcement, etc. Number 2, secondarily to residential services such as scheduled park activities. As outlined in my May 13th, 2020 letter to the Planning Commission, I oppose this change from DA to DR projects in the in the TA Tier 3 housing projects greater than 90,000 square feet. As was seen with the trailer park and other developments, the city has created a financial entitlement by the movement from a DA to a DR for any property that meets the requirements in the transit adjacent district, currently reported at 27. This means that this change from the DCP.
Okay, thank you. Do we have the next one, please?
Okay. The next one is from Jim Gerstley. Jim writes, I disagree with the concept of any large development project going forward based on administrative approval alone without input from the residents who are potentially affected and the resulting environmental impact. I live at 1118 3rd Street across an alley from a proposed low-income housing project to be located on the parking lot on 2nd Street across the alley from our 6-story condo building. The environmental impact of such a structure includes loss of natural sunlight, major impact on fresh air availability from the prevailing westerly winds, potential additional noise from various sources.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is this for our item? Is this public comment for item 9A? This sounds like a response to the DEIR for another project.
Guys, the subject line says Planning Commission item 9A for 520 DCP Tier 3 projects over 90,000 square feet.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Sure. Will undoubtedly result in higher heating bills in winter and reduced health environments for residents located on the west side of our building. If views from existing residences, ocean views in our case, are impacted, that will result in reducing property values and property tax revenue to the city. The bigger the project, the bigger the impact to the neighborhood. For these reasons, an environmental review and input from residents affected by such projects should be required in order to minimize environmental impact on nearby residences.
He's misnumbered his comment. I think.
What was that?
I think Sean's right that he's actually responded to the DEIR on the Miramar.
Okay. Shall I stop?
Yeah, I think that's.
He started out by talking about this item, whether he verged off. He started out by talking about this item. Just get through it.
Okay. Who said that?
Okay, for these reasons, an environmental impact review and input from residents affected by such projects should be required in order to minimize environmental impact on nearby residences. I assume that if there are commercial developments associated with the 100% housing project, that they still have to go through a developmental agreement process? Thank you. Jim Gerstley, 3rd Street.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Next letter from Jason Eastlas. Good evening, Chair Lambert and Planning Commissioners. I provided comment last week on this issue and wanted to share that comment again for the record tonight. My name is Jason Eastlas, and as many of you know, I grew up in Santa Monica. I currently live in the Pico neighborhood. It's no secret that I am passionate about what I consider to be our community's duty to provide adequate housing at all levels of affordability. We have been struggling with the realities of a regional housing shortage for decades now, and unfortunately, the current pandemic has the potential to exacerbate the crisis. From an equity perspective, from a livability perspective, and from an environmentally sustainability perspective, we desperately need new housing in downtown Santa Monica. Please consider streamlining the process by removing the DA requirement for Tier 3 housing projects. Next one is from the Board of Northeast Neighbors. Dear Planning Commissioners, we are offended by the use of the euphemism streamlining of the community about their concern for the future of downtown Santa Monica, and we urge you to inform the City Council that you reject 9A. Do not hand our city over to developers to do as they wish. Reject the simplistic checklist of the development review process in massive Tier 3 housing projects in downtown, and retain the development agreement requirement. Without a DA, these 90,000 plus square foot projects will not be required to generate significant community benefits. State law allows for up to 5 public hearings and meetings on any proposed project that includes housing. We should certainly require that many meetings on housing projects of 90,000 square feet. Even if you think that input from the public is a waste of time, why would you vote to silence yourselves? Vote no on 9A. Sincerely, the Board of Northeast Neighbors. Next letter. Dear Commissioners, please reject 9A. Muzzling the public and making it easier for developers will result in reckless development that harms everyone. Thank you. Signed, Elizabeth Lehrer, NOMA resident. Next is from Matthew Stevens. I strongly support item 9A. This is a common sense process improvement which will encourage badly needed housing in downtown Santa Monica. The proposal does not change any zoning limits downtown. Rather, it simply makes the approval process for new housing more predictable and transparent. This makes housing cheaper, which makes housing more accessible for young people like me and many others who have struggled with the high cost of housing in Santa Monica. I have seen several community members state that this proposal will eliminate public input from housing development. This is not true. Development review permits still require public hearings and still require an affirmative vote of this commission. As a parting thought, I want to highlight one key constituency who you are not hearing from, the future residents of these buildings. They are the largest beneficiaries of this proposal, but they aren't sharing their views because they don't know who they are yet. Perhaps you will hear from dozens who will complain about this proposal, but there are literally thousands of others who will live in these buildings and thus would obviously be supported. As you evaluate public comment, I hope you keep these future residents in mind. Thank you. Happy students. And our next one from Abby Arnold. Dear Planning Commissioners, I am reiterating my comments below from your last hearing for the record. Both my adult sons join me in urging you to adopt the streamlining measures that will make it faster and less costly to build more housing in Santa Monica. I am a homeowner in the southern section of Ocean Park near the Venice border. I have 2 adult children who are unable to live in Santa Monica, where they were born and raised, because we have such a severe shortage of housing. Both of them live in small downtown apartments in other California cities. In order to provide homes for people like my sons, we need to build more housing downtown Santa Monica. I strongly support removing the requirement for development agreements for the Tier 3 housing projects, along with other changes that will make it easier and less costly to build more housing in our city. Very truly yours, Abby Arnold. Okay, next is from Paula Larmore. Dear Commissioners, I urge you to recommend approval of the DCP and zoning ordinance amendments proposed in Agenda Item 9A. These amendments will remove current barriers to housing production and align the city's code with recent changes in state law. Number 1, the DA process is an impediment to maximizing housing in the transit-adjacent district. DAs take too long and are unpredictable. Given the state's mandate to build more housing, housing should be incentivized rather than discouraged, where both LUFS and DCP call for new housing to be located. Any housing built in downtown relieves the pressure to put that additional unit in the residential neighborhoods. Number 2, now that the DCP and other code amendments requiring community benefits and enhanced sustainability requirements for new projects have been adopted, the benefits of the DA do not justify the burdens, particularly because the result has been no new DA applications filed for housing projects since 2016. Number 3, the DRP process allows for ample public input and city review. Number 4, in 2 recent council discussions about strategies to incentivize housing production, council members discussed elimination of the DA requirement for Tier 3 housing projects. Number 5, while more fundamental reforms to the city's development standards and requirements are needed, many of these will require environmental review and may not be implemented for years. Number 6, removing the DA requirement is an impediment to housing that can and should be removed now while the city works on the more fundamental reforms. In addition, aligning the DCP's definition of housing project with the state's Housing Accountability Act is important. It provides some additional flexibility that may assist with feasibility and viability of housing projects, while also addressing a problem created by the city's narrow definition of mezzanine. Signed, Paula. And there are 2 additional attachments, and we'll make sure that you guys all see those later on. The next letter from Jennifer Kennedy writes, Dear Planning Commission, please find the enclosed letter from Santa Monica for renters' rights from co-chairs Mike Soloff and Denny Zane regarding item 9A. Dear Chairperson Lambert, Vice Chairperson Landers, and members of the Planning Commission, we are writing to express SMRR's strong opposition to staff's proposed amendments to the Downtown Community Plan, DCP. Proposed text revisions to the definition of a housing project and proposed amendments to the zoning ordinance covered by your item 9A. SMRR opposes these staff proposals because they eliminate any meaningful involvement by the City Council, the only body with democratic legitimacy in the city, as well as the state constitutional referendum rights of the residents with respect to the wisdom for the city of projects of any square footage without limit in the transit adjacent zone. It eliminates for projects of any square footage without limit in the transit adjacent zone the current requirement of the DCP that projects greater than 90,000 square feet are expected to provide community benefits that contribute to the downtown's priorities and fees in excess of Tier 3 fee requirements, without providing any supporting economic analysis. They make additional changes of the economic benefit to developers that are applicable to projects of any square footage without limit in the transit adjacent zone. 1, without providing any analysis of the size of that benefit and whether that benefit warrants an increase in community benefit requirements from developers. 2, without expressly limiting these benefits to projects that deliver housing for permanent city residents rather than furnished short-term or medium-term rentals to unnatural persons. And 3, without expressly providing that projects taking advantage of these new rules necessarily are subject to the affordable housing requirements applicable to post-11-10-16 applications, example, without expressly precluding an assertion that developers can amend applications submitted prior to 11-11-16 and still take advantage of proposed new standards. These additional proposed economic benefits include 1, increasing the amount of commercial usages in a housing project from 25% to 33%, with the commercial uses allowed on floors other than the ground floor, and 2, reducing the time and risk associated with development through use of a development review permit process rather than a development agreement process. Make a change of economic benefit to developers in any zone within the DCP, increasing the amount of commercial usages in a housing project from 25% to 33%, with the commercial uses allowed on floors other than the ground floor, again 1, without providing any analysis of the size of that benefit and whether that benefit warrants an increase in community benefit requirements from developers, number 2, without expressly limiting these benefits to projects that deliver housing for permanent city residents rather than furnished short-term or medium-term rentals to unnatural persons, and 3, without expressly providing that projects taking advantage of these new rules necessarily are subject to the affordable housing requirements applicable to post 1110-16 applications, and replace the downtown community plan process, a process that thousands of Santa Monicans participated in order to help design and shape the community in which they live and work, with an unnecessarily rushed process of staff proposals based primarily on input from developers and their paid lobbyists. We urge you to reject the changes before you and insist instead that any process for considering changes to the DCP requirements be a thoughtful, open, and analytically sound process that evaluates what best serves the goals of the city and its residents. Sincerely, Denny Zane and Mike Soloff, co-chairs of Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. Next one is from Leonora Kamner. Good evening, Chair Lambert and Planning Commissioners. My name is Leonora Kamner, and I live in the Wilmot neighborhood. I'm Managing Director of Abundant Housing LA, a pro-housing advocacy and outreach organization. I'm extremely concerned about the future of the city if we don't act now to increase housing production. The Regional Housing Needs Assessment requires us to build at least 9,000 new homes over the next 8 years. That's not just a scale requirement. That number represents the people and families who need homes here. If we don't do this, housing costs will get worse, more people will be displaced, and we will fail to adequately rebuild our economy post-pandemic. Please streamline the housing process by removing the DA requirement for Tier 3 housing projects. I believe that we can be a city that puts people and families first. By building more homes, we can build an inclusive, equitable future here while also creating the conditions for economic recovery. I believe in this community and that we can create a better city for our children. I hope we take this first streamlining step and build on this with more pro-housing economic recovery policies. Thank you. Leonora Kamner. Dear Chair Lambert and Planning Commissioners, attached, please find a petition signed by Santa Monica Forward, Abundant Housing LA, and almost 50 community members supporting the recommendation to streamline the approval process for Tier 3 housing projects in the downtown. Below are my public comments for tonight's meeting. Good evening, Chair Lambert and Planning Commissioners. I'm Carl Hansen, a housing commissioner and resident of the Wilmot neighborhood, but speaking tonight as co-chair of Santa Monica Forward. Santa Monica Forward, Abundant Housing LA, and around 50 community members have signed a petition supporting the recommendation to approve Tier 3 housing projects in the downtown through a DRP process. We shared that petition with you by email this afternoon. The coronavirus pandemic has only exacerbated the housing shortage crisis. Community members have advocated for equity, transparency, and efficiency throughout city government. The proposal before you tonight reflects all 3 of those key values. The unpredictable and expensive DA process has already stopped multiple housing projects in Santa Monica, and developers that do move forward often end up building less housing on sites that could be significant sources of new market rate and affordable housing. Applicants and the public alike deserve the predictability and transparency that comes with a development review permit. Optimizing housing production within established zoning envelopes is key to responding to the housing shortage crisis, supporting the production of new affordable housing, and addressing our affordable housing obligations under state law, RHNA. Please recommend that Tier 3 housing projects in the downtown be approved through the much more equitable, transparent, and efficient DRP process. Thank you. Carl Hansen. And it attaches the petition that has 48 signatures on it from the neighborhood. Okay. And we are on the last one. And it is from Stephen Welliver, who writes, Dear Planning Commissioners, our letter submitted to you yesterday evening inadvertently omitted a clarifying statement that the recommendations contained within are from the staff of downtown Santa Monica. The staff recommends support for elimination The staff recommends support for elimination of the 90,000 square foot threshold for DRPs on housing projects and the adoption of a housing project definition that aligns with state statute. Due to meeting schedules, the recommendation has not been vetted by our board of directors. Thanks, Stephen Welliver. And you guys already have the previous letter that was in your correspondence packet this morning. Okay, we're done.
Thank you. So it's now open for discussion. I'm going to go down the line for the discussion and then open it up after that. So Commissioner Fonda Bernardi, do you have any comments?
Yeah, it seems that we've entered a period of time where we're opening up all the floodgates to things we don't know we're going to get. So, for example, we're saying go up to 1/3 of the square footage for commercial uses, where before we were only opening up to 1/4 of that for commercial uses. So what we're really saying is that there's an 8% chance, that 8% difference, that we might actually get the 30% units that we want from that 8%. And I'm not sure that that's going to produce the 30% units. So I'm very uncomfortable with increasing something in an area that you and I know is going to be weakened, meaning the demand for office space, the demand for retail space is going to go way, way down for the next 5 years. So we're opening something up that we don't need to open up because we're trying to get housing. So I'm just saying, is this really a useful way to go? So I would like to eliminate that 8% increase, keep it at 25%, which is where it was originally. My comment.
Thank you. Mr. Fresco.
Sorry. I have, in general, I get the idea that we're trying to make it easier to get more housing and to get that 30%. But I also feel there are some holes and that we're giving away some things that we might not need to give away. First of all, I know that the idea of GAMP expires in January. I don't really understand why it expires. It's a really important idea to fix that connection between Ocean Park and the Civic Center and downtown. And it's a huge clog and a bottleneck and the freeway and it's a mess. And we realized that when we did the plan, and we set aside this area as something to discuss and plan for. And by opening up this incentive to build these giant buildings, and that affects very few sites, and some of them are GAMP, we're going to basically destroy the opportunity to do that for generations. So for starters, I would like to omit the GAMP area, which is 3 or 4 of those sites that are on the map. I would like to reserve the opportunity to fix that problem in our city for this generation and not have to wait 50 or 75 years for those buildings to fall down. So that's one of my big concerns. The reason we had those DAs in the first place, as I understood it, and it says so in the DCP, is that those bigger projects need special review and have more impact on the city and can also generate more feasibility, so that we might be able to get more benefits out of. So we've taken that whole benefit idea out of the package by turning it into a DR and being limited by our nexus studies. And I don't know, and I know that some of you who have your own ways of crunching numbers have determined that somehow that extra feasibility that we intended to use to benefit our community is somehow necessary to get those extra units designated as affordable. But we don't really know that. We're just sort of guessing that and assuming that, and it's kind of knee-jerk, and it makes me really uncomfortable, and I want to make sure we're not leaving things on the table. Maybe we weren't getting the 30% because they weren't getting this amount of development, but perhaps there's also some other added feasibility that maybe we could get 31%. I just don't know. And I don't think that anybody actually knows. And I would like to make sure. So I'm uncomfortable because of that. Let me just check here. And the whole ARB question being up in the air when we're going to go ahead with this, because basically what we're saying is tier 3 projects over 90,000 square feet, because we have all of our development standards, these much bigger than 90,000 square foot projects are going to be very, very long and have huge amounts of street frontage and single projects. And that, without a real ARB and just a sideline to ARB telling us how to address the design issues, is a really frightening thought for our city. And this could have a really bad impact. And I would like to know how the ARB is going to land before we know what the impact of that aspect of this change will be. So those are my concerns right now.
Thank you. Commissioner Landris.
Okay. So I have a few thoughts. I want to try to not repeat what I said last week, but I will I will do my best here. Yeah, I'm going to do my best here. I want to bring some new things up. So first of all, I want to say that I think our rules should be our rules, and our rules should be as predictable and as accessible and as transparent as possible. And I believe that DAs are none of those things. I believe that there are good reasons for DAs. I think there are good reasons for DAs on the large sites because they are so out of scale relative to the rest of the loose that it's important to have a community-wide conversation. And I get that, even with all the private conversations that will no doubt take place. I oppose housing DAs. I believe that we should be setting our democratically elected government, the point was made in public comment, our city council should be setting height, FAR, density, all those pieces, development standards. We have processes for that. And once those are established, it should be very clear whether or not a project can be approved or not. And no one should be using a discretionary process to achieve other policy goals, such as limiting housing in the city when our council and the state government have made clear that there needs to be more housing. I think this issue came to the council in December and again in March. We are not the final deciders here. Certainly our input is extremely important, and I take our role seriously, but this is a conversation that council has directed us to have. I think we're having it, and I want to speak generally in favor of the staff recommendation. So that's number one. Number two, I want to bring up two pieces that I think are important from the letter that we received from Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. One piece is that this assertion that somehow there are projects in the pipeline that would be able to be amended using pre-2016 affordability requirements. I checked with staff before the meeting, followed my instructions, and have been told, and am happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, that there are no projects that could be amended to somehow get around the new affordability requirements that our city council has established. So I'd really like to take that piece off the table. The second issue, you won't be surprised to hear from me about this, but I'll tell you the conversation I had with Heidi. I do think that the kinds of limitations that our council put on the prior streamlining ordinance in Tier 2 may be worth discussing here in terms of ensuring that the housing that we are streamlining is actual housing and not medium-term housing and not the kind of housing that disrupts our attempts to secure much-needed permanent housing for Santa Monica residents. So although we cannot put it, I'm told, this is my conversation with Heidi, although we cannot put it into our recommendation tonight, I would recommend that we encourage council to find ways to ensure that this kind of DRP requires permanent housing. That means 1-year initial leases and rentals to natural persons. And I share those concerns, as you know. And the advice that I've been given is that there is a generally applicable ordinance pending. And I think that we should try to get those ordinances done simultaneously so that we don't create a vesting window that could inadvertently create the possibility of medium-term housing. So I do have that concern and would like to make that recommendation. That having been said, I believe that it is absolutely appropriate for council to look at the requirements for Tier 3 above and below 90,000 square feet. We could be having really important conversations about new building materials, sustainable building materials, environmentally responsible construction. All of those things are things that should be happening at maybe by us, maybe by council, and those are conversations worth having. We got a letter last week from Loreen Von Clan encouraging us to look at incentivizing sustainable development materials, and I think that's really smart. But that's within the context of democratic quasi-judicial process that is easy to understand, very clear to applicants and developers alike. And so with that one recommendation, I will be supporting the staff report.
Thank you. Commissioner McKinnon.
Tonight is about process. It's about how projects arrive and are entitled. And those limited number of projects which are above 90,000 square feet, and in this limited part of the city, is it better to process them through development application or through DRP? If we go back to the zoning code and then the DCP, one of our key considerations was to introduce absolute predictability for both the people who are residents in the city to know what they'd get in terms of building and people who are considering building here. That's what it's done. When you enter a project in the downtown or anywhere else,
I have to take a break real quick. John, sorry.
Is in charge.
Please continue.
So when someone comes to Santa Monica and is attempting to do a project in neighbourhood commercial area or a neighbourhood village in the downtown, they know what they're allowed to build. 5 floors, certain amount of FAR, and there's a certain amount of community benefit that's given. We're saying we're now going to introduce that, or between Tier 2 and Tier 3. In other words, to go from approximately 60, 65 feet to 84 feet in this small part of the city. That just seems to make a lot of sense to me. It makes a lot of sense because in the time that I've been on this body, the early part was devoted to DAs, even for small buildings, 4 and 5 stories. There wasn't a night that I left the Planning Commission thinking that I'd got as much as I could have out of a developer. But since the DRP has been in place, wow, they have to turn up. They put the 25% affordable on the table. They pay 90% in a TIF fee. They pay 90% in another fee. It's absolutely guaranteed. There's not a discussion about it, and we can get down to whether or not we think it's having too big an impact on the city. That hasn't happened. And then what the design looks like. And there are certain other issues. But the predictability is very important. And I think that that's important going forward because we now live in a different time. The time we live in is the corona time. That has changed everything. We haven't yet seen it because we're only 12 weeks into this era. But this era is going to level huge numbers of business, economic activity, destroyed employment. The ability, if people have capital, to invest it in the city and produce jobs, housing, and affordable housing and community benefits in this city is going to be quite important. And so we shouldn't lose sight of that. That is one of it's the biggest sea change that we could have imagined ever. So you cannot ignore that. So with the predictability that we already have, knowing how much time is cut out of the process, and that there are safeguards, because if people do not like what the DRP produces, they can go to the City Council and appeal it. I think we should support it. However, The open question remains, what happens with design? Because design is important. We don't want the back end of buses being built all over the place with no review. So that is an important element, and if the planning department not come up with a process this evening, some sort of advice on design, I don't think you could support it. And as we move forward, we do have to have a formal process that allows people to raise issues both at the Planning Commission and about the design of these bigger sites, bigger projects. That's critical. Thank you.
Thank you. I very much agree with what Commissioner McKinnon just said. I think he said it very eloquently, as well as most of Commissioner Landers' comments, and so I don't want to repeat them, but it's all about predictability. It's very much about predictability now when we are trying to attract people to build housing. We need the housing. We want the housing. And development agreements are just ripe for, I think, abuse. They're ripe for political negotiation, and they don't necessarily bring community benefit, which is, so there is, Santa Monica is one of the most expensive places to develop. And it is because our rents are high, but it's also because of process and because things like development agreements. And so why wouldn't we, during this period, encourage there to be more housing when we can? I do have some concern about the 30% affordable, and, are we doing enough? I don't want perfect to be the enemy of the good, however, and so I would really like to be able to move this forward. I like the recommendations of making sure that we have design review, and I would also, if we can also send the message to the council to expedite the looking at the 30%, I would appreciate that. But I think it's something that we need to do, and I'm prepared to support it. You're on mute, Leslie. You're on mute.
I think it's in my court now. So interesting set of issues. I want to go to, I think, which is the easiest one of this, which is the definition that allows commercial to be on other than the first floor. I think that's somewhat of a no-brainer, and I hope that everybody is supportive of that. I am a little perplexed by the increase up to 33%. I do think that flexibility is important to give financing, an opportunity for people to get their finances and build projects. But we really want the housing. We don't want the commercial. And staff has already told us that they haven't really seen anybody max out on the 25%. So I'm on the fence about supporting that one. But the big issue of do we do away with the DEAs for these types of projects and go to DRP, I'm pretty supportive of. This is the kind of development that I think is important. Right near transit, we put density, and we couldn't get closer to the transit with this project. I also think what I heard tonight was whether we have a development agreement or a DRP, the Housing Accountability Act ties our hands, and that we can't use objective standards to say, well, I just don't think this is a good project and I'm gonna kill it. I'm afraid that we could put on so many ornaments that at some point the developer says to us, we can't do this anymore. We go ahead and we deny the project. They sue us. They end up getting the project that they wanted. I'm afraid of that. So I think going to a DRP where we have a defined set of process and a defined set of benefits makes a lot of sense, especially for that predictability issue, which is pretty critical when you're doing development. Let's see, there were some comments about the metro sites, and they're getting back into play. I think that we would be pretty happy with that. I work on projects where Metro leases their property, and 90% of the projects I see, they're leasing their property to affordable developers. And the affordable developers are building, 100% affordable projects, and they're using architects who can really design projects highly because they typically have less parking, and with less parking, they put more money into the design of the building. I agree that it's a little troubling that we don't know where our ARB is, but I think our ARB was in trouble before the COVID crisis because of the state rules that says we have to only use objective zoning standards. So we were headed towards a place, whether we had talked about it a little bit on the commission, but we were headed towards a place where we had to create new rules that were very prescribed, that talked about design, because we were not going to be able to just put our finger in the wind and say, no, I don't like that design. So that was already headed out the door. So I'm open to the discussion on whether we should actually go to 30%, but generally I'm supportive of where staff is going on this. I think that there is a big discussion coming in the future about the affordability levels. But as somebody pointed out to me, look, if somebody bites now and says they want to give us 30%, we shouldn't really fight with that. So those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, I have a few. First is I firmly don't believe that development agreements are appropriate for housing projects. Housing projects don't have the kind of profit leeway that large commercial projects have. So I think it's always been inappropriate to have development agreements imposed on housing projects. They just don't have the level of fat, if you will, the more community benefits can be taken out of, like a commercial project. There's not been a housing GA in Santa Monica since 2016, which kind of illustrates what I'm saying. And somebody in the community provided me some numbers. Between 2013 and 2016, there were 7 housing DAs. They averaged between 2 years and 4 months and 3 years and 7 months to get approval from the city. There were 12 DRPs for housing projects, and their average time was 5 months to 1 year, 1 month. So that shows you the incredible time savings of going through the DRP, and that means cost savings, that means more housing. And we all know DRP is believe me, we've sat through enough DRP hearings to know that it's a very transparent, publicly involved process. We're not cutting anybody out of this process. I think that whoever makes this motion is clear that we all have concerns about design review for larger projects, that whoever makes the motion includes some kind of robust design review statement if we proceed the way we are. I support the 33% for commercial, and the reason, I don't think we're going to see it that often, the reason I do is I have for a long time believed that our inclusionary housing program downtown does not work. And so if an increase in commercial square footage would make it work, then it's worth trying that. And if we see a project coming in with 33% commercial and 30% affordable, then that will prove that, and I think it's worth that attempt. And again, the idea that somebody is saving money by having a faster process going through the city has not been proved by any analysis done by HRNA. So I think we need to keep that in mind. If somebody gets a year and a half cut off their processing time, it doesn't mean the housing is necessarily going to be cheaper. It just needs to be here faster, and that's really important for me. So with that, I will open it up to a motion or a discussion.
I'd like to make a motion.
Commissioner Landris.
And I just want to ask, but I want to ask Heidi for clarification. The definition of a housing project is that something that is citywide or only in the DCP tonight?
It's only in the DCP. Yes. Well, you don't actually have a definition of housing project that's that confining elsewhere in the zoning ordinance. And the purpose behind the definition in the DCP is to incentivize the projects through development standards and process thresholds. So you just don't have a similar issue in the zoning.
So what I would like to do is because I'm hearing that there are some differences among commissioners on different things. I would like to ask you to tell me how to make a motion to change the definition of a housing project such that non-residential uses do not exceed 33% of the total building square footage and are limited to neighborhood commercial uses, period. Only that for now.
What does that mean?
I want to split because we have different, I'm noticing that there are different views on the DR processing and the housing process definition. And so I want to move the housing process definition so we can get it out of the way.
Well, I wouldn't support the neighborhood commercial plan.
But that's what's in, that you already are. It's what's in the, that's what's before us. The red line is on page 35 of the packet, of the staff report.
What about office?
Well, that is not what's there. It says, I mean, look at page 30. I'm just following I'm making a motion for the staff recommendation on the definition of housing project.
I see.
Which states
I see.
that as revised, mixed-use developments consistent. A housing project means a use consisting of any of the following: 1, residential units only; 2, and this is as proposed by staff.
I see.
Mixed-use developments consisting of residential and non-residential uses, in which non-residential uses that do not exceed 33% of the total building square footage and are limited to neighborhood commercial uses. Period. 3, transitional or supportive housing. That's the staff report for the housing definition.
I'm not sure how feasible neighborhood commercial limitations are.
We can get into discussion. That's my motion, just bifurcating out that one piece, because I heard some distinctions among our colleagues. But anybody, I don't know if there's a second for discussion.
Sure.
Is that Nina seconding for discussion?
I'll second
for discussion.
Okay.
And I have a question for staff about that, which is, isn't this definition that's proposed by staff based on what the HAA definition of housing is, and aren't we just adopting that into our code? Isn't that what this is?
Yes. So
Do they have neighborhood commercial in the law? Is neighborhood commercial said in the law?
No, it isn't. It's just non-residential. Yeah, the neighborhood commercial, that's from CEQA, so we could, that's not in the HAA.
What do you mean that's from CEQA?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
You said that's from CEQA. What does that mean?
Essentially, it just, I think we've just seen largely it's like retail. Or just neighborhood serving, but I don't think we actually intended to include that.
So stop after footage?
Yeah.
I'm fine stopping after footage.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't want to do something that will accidentally create a CEQA problem.
No, it's not. It doesn't.
Okay. Okay, so my motion now stops. I'm revising my motion. I'm just stopping after the word footage.
Nina?
I'm still trying to, people keep talking over me. I don't think Jing has heard my question. I want to know what she means by that's from CEQA. What did CEQA have to do with putting that caveat in there about neighborhood commercial?
So because at the time we were looking for something, some guidance in terms of what a limitation on commercial uses would be in a housing project. At the time, because the HAA at the time didn't have a 33% limit, it limited non-residential uses to the first floor of a housing project, and then, above the first floor it had to be housing. That's all it said. There wasn't like a percentage requirement. So we looked at CEQA, which for an exemption for housing projects included this provision under 21159.24 in CEQA. So that's where that came from, and I think that was the time. So, sorry, Nina, I didn't hear you there.
Yeah, you keep cutting out too, so I think you're done, and then I talk over you.
Okay.
But does that mean that if one of these projects with 33% commercial put office in that 33%, it wouldn't be exempt from CEQA? What you said?
No, that's not true. No, so this was back. Again, we were using it as a guideline because we were trying to find some guidance because there was an interest in putting a cap on it. So we looked to CEQA because we knew there was a directive in there, but there's not. Okay. But that's not necessary now because the HAA actually has this 33% number. But like I said, it is a policy decision of the city. We are not forced to adopt the definition of a housing project. This is purely something that can be local if the commission feels that 25% is appropriate, or whatever number, there's nothing magic about it. But where the flexibility is with respect to where the location of those uses can be.
Okay, Nina? I just want to add something. My concern about including neighborhood commercial, we're hearing this from DTSM and other merchant organizations around the city, is that we have a glut of ground floor retail space. So, in fact, there's even talk about not requiring retail on the first floor of some of the next housing projects that come along. So requiring this to be neighborhood commercial seems counterintuitive given what we're hearing from the commercial community in Santa Monica.
We're taking it out.
I would want to take it out. Yeah. You're going to have a lot of vacant space.
I took it out of my motion. My motion stops at footage.
Okay, cool. Is there a second?
Who had the second?
Wait, Sean, I didn't hear what he said.
Sorry,
I had the second, but I don't know what Sean said.
My motion is to stop after footage, so that a housing project means a use consisting of any of the following. I'll skip to number 2. Mixed-use developments consisting of residential and non-residential uses in which non-residential uses do not exceed 33% of the total building square footage. Period.
Okay.
Okay. I can support that.
Should we vote on that and then go on to the next thing? Would that work for you guys?
Yeah, Commission. Yeah.
Go to the chat room if you want to talk.
Jim is frozen, and he had okay.
Who's frozen? I've been frozen off and on too. So does anyone want to discuss this?
Yeah, I don't see Jim.
What? I just think from everything we've heard from the community of businesses, putting in more community serving office, whatever the heck it is not going to work because there's already a glut of neighborhood commercial stuff.
I think everybody's in agreement on that. I think the only question is, does it make sense to go up to 33%? And I think the value there is it gives some flexibility in financing.
Yes.
But it takes us away from building more housing is a counter argument. But
if it makes the housing project feasible,
wouldn't they be able?
But it doesn't require you to do that.
I understand.
I think that 33% will likely make housing more feasible downtown. That's why I'm voting for it. Okay.
It just, if it's part of the state definition.
Yeah.
Rich is either asleep or he's frozen. Okay.
Yeah. Can we vote?
Okay, let's take a roll call vote.
I'm sorry, maybe Heidi can jump in here. What are you voting on the whole thing, or are you taking a straw poll?
No, just the 33%.
So procedurally, I think at some point we'll need a vote from you on the 2 resolutions that are before you. So there's actually 2 separate resolutions. One is the changes to the DCP, and one is the changes to the zoning ordinance. So if you want to do this as a straw poll, that's totally fine. But unfortunately, we will need kind of a package deal at the end. One for DCP changes and one for zoning ordinance changes.
Ron, do you want to do that?
Heidi, can I ask a procedural question? Because these are wrapped into those 2 resolutions, it doesn't split easily.
Right.
How would you like us to? My intention was to vote on this so that we don't have to deal with it again.
Sure.
So how would you like us to vote so that we put this, we put this aside and then we go and vote on the resolution, and we're done?
But it's part of the resolution.
Right. So I think the planning manager can also help with your past practice, but one way you could do it is to vote on each piece and then have a motion at the end that says, I'm incorporating what we decided on, to break down each individual piece, what we decided on the housing project definition, what you decided on each piece.
Right.
And then you have a global one at the end.
Okay.
Terrific.
Great.
Okay.
So let's have a roll call vote on Sean's motion.
Okay, yeah, so just wanted to be clear. Okay, so this is on that deleting the neighborhood commercial part.
Yes.
What Sean read, okay.
And the 33%.
Right, okay. Commissioner Fonda?
And the second floor.
And the second floor.
And the second floor.
Yeah.
Do we have a roll call
Right.
vote, please?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
No, because I'm still convinced that 25% is what we want.
Commissioner Fresco?
Where'd you go?
Yes, I have just been gone for several minutes. I got kicked off. I have no idea what just happened, so I need a recap.
We're taking a vote on Sean's motion to go to 33% and take out commercial, neighbor commercial, and allow it on more than the first floor.
And
Okay.
it's
Sorry.
this is a straw vote. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, Commissioner
What's your
Fresco?
vote?
Oh, sorry. It keeps cutting out. Yes.
Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon?
Yes.
Commissioner Pastor?
Yes.
Commissioner Reese?
Yes.
Chair Lambert?
Yes. Okay.
We get everybody?
Yeah.
Okay.
You won.
No, I'm I got a unanimous vote. No, not unanimous. Mario voted
No,
against it.
Mario didn't vote for you.
Mario voted no. No, signal is coming in and out.
All right.
May I move the rest of it? I'll move the
Yeah.
rest of it. Great.
But
I'll
I
move the
can't
I move the resolutions.
Okay.
So
Both of-
I'm moving the streamlining.
Can we do them both at once?
Can we, Heidi?
Go.
So you can.
Well,
just
let's
to make
talk about Streamline first.
sure.
Oh,
So
okay. I
So
thought we
just
did.
procedurally, quickly, just to be clear, so what's in the DCP is the housing project definition, and it's moving the approval of the tier 3 projects over 90,000 square feet down to the development review permit. The other piece would be the changes to the ordinance, which is the project requirements, which would
Can we do
be
DCP
aligning
first?
those project requirements.
Yeah, so I'll move
DCP.
I'll move DCP incorporating by reference the motion that we just passed.
Second. Oh, I can't second. Who's going to second it?
Lisa
Right.
seconded it.
I'll second.
I'm sorry. Things are not.
Do we want to include some
Can you
language about design review and what we're doing?
I want to make that direction because I don't want council to. I think we have to do the red line vote, and then I think we have to give
Okay.
recommendations to council not to do this until they've addressed
Okay.
design review and, for me, medium-term housing as well. But yeah,
Okay.
Okay.
So that was a motion. Was there a second?
Can I?
Wait. Was there a second to Sean's motion?
I second.
Okay, Elisa's second. Commissioner Fresco.
Yeah. In terms of Sean's concern about medium-term housing, and he talked about sustainable materials and all of those things, those are all exactly the kinds of things that I was referring to before that had to do with lost feasibility and flexibility that we could build into standards, and we could still provide the same kind of certainty and predictability, but we're just not taking the time to make sure that we're asking for what we need to do to make these projects be what they can be. And they're not necessarily huge burdens that would impact the amount of housing, but they're things that would be really important in projects this huge. We have more to mitigate when a project is this big, and I think we have to think about it. So John is adding things that he thinks are important to the motion, and I don't disagree with him, but I'm really concerned about the fact that we're kind of doing it on the fly. And then, of course, I would also like to discuss the idea of GAMP, and if we really just want to throw that under the so-called bus. Because I just feel like that was a good pun. Come on, guys.
That was very good.
Because I want to make sure, thank you. But I do want to make sure that
You're frozen.
giving up mobility. Unfrozen?
You were.
Am I here? Am I
You're
back?
there.
Hello?
You're there.
Okay.
We're here. We
I
can
just
hear
want
you.
to make sure that we don't stop our plan. That's all. We made an important, and I don't want to quit now. So can we suggest maybe omitting GAMP from the tier 3 potential that would receive this streamlining?
John, is that subject to, it's not acceptable to the maker of the motion?
That's not a friendly amendment, but I also want to clarify that my motion is red line only, and there is a separate motion on standards. I absolutely want to have those conversations about standards when we get to the standards. But this is the streamlining resolution, and so my motion is really only the streamlining resolution at this point.
What do you mean getting to the standards?
There's a separate motion, there's a separate resolution asking the council to set standards, tier 3 above 90,000, and that's where Commissioner Fresco has raised some concerns, I've raised some concerns that we need to recommend to council that those standards be set.
Commissioner McKinnon.
So, Harriet, yeah. So, okay. So, the motions are in fact linked. You can't just separate the two out. They are, for purposes, directed in different ways, but nonetheless, we need to think of them together. And the reality is that some of the things that we're talking about are unnecessary because we have a building code and we also have environmental regulations which say that if you build a building in Santa Monica, it's got to be 15% more sustainable than the state code. So whenever the state code has moved down over the last few years, our code has moved down and demanded more sustainability, number one. Number two, the City Council keeps moving and creating governing ideas in terms of medium-term housing and short-term housing. And that policy is the appropriate place to govern whether or not you let people rent an apartment for a month or 2 months, or because that changes over time and we've tried to squeeze down over a period of time. I think this instrument should be about controlling the size of buildings, the affordability mixes we want in these buildings, the process of building the buildings, and then we should strike these other special pieces of legislation to govern what we allow. Now, I want the tightest rules when it comes to letting out apartments here so that we don't have transitory people flowing through the place. I want tighter sustainability regulations. But in fact, I think altering the sustainability regulation is easier than altering the DCP. And then let's come to the GAMP or the gateway area. Problem with carving out the gateway area is that it is very clear that that will never be tackled in our lifetime, because every other plan that we've had has been put aside. And in the 3 years that we've been sitting here with the DCP, then it hasn't been looked at. It's unlikely to be looked at. We do need to have underlying zoning through the DCP apply to those areas so that we at least can be certain what will or will not be built in that area. So when we come back to the two motions, I'm going to support the streamlining motion. I would argue against putting other things into the inverted commas standards. And finally, we need another motion outside these two requesting the City Council to inject a predictable design review process before this is all passed. Back to you.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So are we ready to vote on this? We have a roll call vote, please.
Okay, this is for first resolution on downtown, right, as amended in that section that you did the straw poll on. So Commissioner Fonda Bernardi?
No.
Commissioner Fresco?
No.
Commissioner Landris?
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon?
Yes.
Commissioner Pastor?
Yes.
Commissioner Reese?
Yes.
And Chair Lambert?
Yes.
Yeah. That's approved 5-2.
Thank you. So now we go to the zoning code development standards resolution. Sean, do you want to continue?
Sure, I'll just move it as I'm going to move the staff report incorporating the housing definition as amended previously.
Okay. Is there a second?
And what you didn't hear, Chair Lambert, was him foreshadow the motion about design review.
Well,
No,
Right.
that'll be
correct,
be
but
the third
Commissioner McKinnon, if I may, that was what I said earlier. We need to do these clean, and then we need to do a separate motion with our recommendations to council, including ideas. I mean, I want them to do the generally applicable medium-term stuff at the same time that they do this, so that what you raised gets addressed externally to this document, but it still gets addressed.
That makes sense. Okay, is there a second to Sean's motion? I'll second it. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Okay, Commissioner Fonda Bernardi,
No.
Commissioner Fresco,
No.
Commissioner Landris,
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon,
Yes.
Commissioner Pastor,
Yes.
Commissioner Reese,
Yes.
and Chair Lambert.
Yes.
That's approved 5-2.
So was that
Commissioner
just the-
McKinnon wants to
was
get
that just the
started on a
housing
motion.
project?
I'd be happy to second it.
Sean, was that just the housing project definition or the whole thing?
We're done. We just did the
We're
whole
done.
thing, but I'd like to, if Commissioner McKinnon wants to get started on a design review
Absolutely.
recommendation, I'll be happy to
Excellent.
second it.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think carrying on the last two, I think we should move a motion which requests the City Council to create a formal design review process as part of changes to the DCP streamlining.
I'll second that.
I have
Is
a
it
question. Question actually. Does that mean basically larger projects being subject to a design review process? Like what projects we're dealing with now, rather than
Yes.
every single thing? Okay.
Yes,
Okay.
I'm
Well-
going to second.
at least.
Okay.
I'm
I
going
would
to
argue-
second that for discussion, and if it's friendly, Commissioner McKinnon, I would like to specify that design review apply at a minimum to development agreements, Tier 3 proposals, and major modifications.
Okay.
And
Do we have,
HRI.
wait a minute. Do we have design review now for major modifications? They don't come to us. They're staff. They only come
We
to
do
us if
not.
they're part of something else.
We do not.
We
Yeah,
get-
major
we get
modifications.
major mods. Only those.
No.
We get them when they're not HAA.
You get them because the permit requires it otherwise needs to go to the planning commission. Otherwise, they're heard by the zoning administrator.
Right,
Just
right,
standing
right, right.
alone, they don't come to the planning commission.
No, they
The
don't.
ones that come, I'm suggesting that the ones that come to the planning commission would continue to
So
go
you're
to
saying, so what you're saying is housing projects that otherwise would need a planning commission approval anyways, that if they have a major modification, they would come.
That's what we do
They would
now.
have to be part of the
Yes.
design review.
Correct. Is that good, Richard?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we
Can
are we exempting 100% affordable housing from all this or not?
They already are, aren't they?
Yes.
Design review? No.
Oh.
I don't think we should.
I think projects up to 50 units, for example.
Yeah, I don't want to change that process. I'm just,
Whatever. Okay.
may we add the recommendation the council bring up its generally applicable medium-term housing ordinance forthwith to that motion, Commissioner?
Can I just clarify, because I had a little conversation, like there's nothing right now is exempt from design review if you're doing new construction.
Okay.
So I just want to be clear about that. For new construction requires board approval, ARB approval in all cases.
Okay.
There's no exemptions.
And if a project involves something listed on the HRI, it also should have design review downtown.
Does that happen now? Are we adding a layer?
No.
It
Just
does not add a layer
in
because, again,
this-
all new construction requires ARB approval, and if it's in, other than a single-family home.
Except that right now the ARB is fading away, so we want to just list our priorities for what we absolutely have to have them do, even though we really need them. They've always done.
Chair, may I make a suggestion? What I'd like to suggest is that we keep it clean for this particular item. Keep it to these three issues because we're talking about streamlining. And when we get to it later in the meeting, I was going to suggest that we add to our June 3rd agenda a discussion of our design review priorities so that we can actually get them on the table for council, because clearly that's important to us, and I don't think we should, I think we should have that conversation, just not right this second.
What do you mean the rest of the meeting?
What do you mean?
Isn't this sort of the last action we're taking on this item?
It is, but I'm suggesting that we not have the design review conversation tonight beyond that which is directly tied to our streamlining recommendation.
And that is your motion.
Yeah, so the motion is, right, and I'm asking Commissioner McKinnon, may we add to the recommendation to council its action on medium-term housing, so that similarly we want council to make its decisions about medium-term housing concomitant with this action, just as we do with design review.
I would like the rest of the commission to weigh in on that.
I don't want to hold this up because it's going to take them longer than it should to do the medium.
No, I think it's necessary. I think, let me put it to you this way. I think design review is absolutely essential because there was a recommendation to get rid of the ARB.
Yeah. Okay.
At some point, that's going to be got rid of.
Right.
There is no suggestion that anything other than the council that they are going to crack down on short-term, medium-term housing and hold the line on that. I'm 100% confident about that. The ARB thing, a little more worried.
Fair enough.
So, as long as there's a focus on that, I think we're fine.
I just don't want to hold up anything waiting for them to do the medium-term housing. So we could be here in December waiting for this to take.
I'm told that it was about ready to go, and then COVID.
Then that's good news. Let's not include it.
Okay.
Richard, can you restate your motion, please?
You have the tough questions, don't you? I, of course, will be relying on the extraordinary word capacities of planning manager Jing Yao to clean this up at some stage. But in essence, Planning Commission requests the City Council to implement a formal design review process as part of changes to the streamlining changes to the DCP and streamlining of Tier 3. So, and Commissioner Landis specified Tier 3. I think you said Tier 2, didn't you?
I said DAs,
Yes.
Tier 3,
Yes.
and major modifications that otherwise would have been required to have been heard by the Planning Commission.
I'm not sure what
You
that means.
understood that. I'm pretty sure
I don't know what that means. That could be like a small project that needs made. Why would we need design review on that?
So I would take the first two straight away.
Yeah,
Yeah,
fine.
exactly.
Let's just do for Tier 3, and that's fine. Tier 3 and DAs.
Yeah.
DAs and Tier 3s.
Okay, good. Can we vote on that?
I think we need a
Roll call vote.
Wait, Jim's got something.
Commissioner Reese, I see your hand. No one is using the chat room. Okay.
Yeah, I tried to chat. So I like the idea. I think I worry about the fact again that we can't be putting in subjective design standards. These need to be, codified design rules in the code based on current law I'm seeing. But I like the concept, and that's my only comment.
I mean, there's only so much of objectivity you can put in design standards. As you know, that's kind of a dilemma.
Well, the law says.
I know what the law says. It's just it's sort of a challenge to find objective design standards. Okay, can we have a roll call vote, please?
Commissioner Fonda Bernardi,
Yes.
Commissioner Fresco,
Yes.
Commissioner Landris,
Yes.
Commissioner McKinnon,
yes.
Commissioner Pastor,
Yes.
Commissioner Reese,
Yes.
Chair Lambert.
Yes.
So, may
Is
I
that
make, it may fail for lack of a second, but I would like to move that we request that the council take up its generally applicable ordinance on medium-term housing as soon as possible in relation to this streamlining, and that council also explore the possibility of additional sustainable sustainable building requirements or incentives, sustainable building incentives related to Tier 3, larger Tier 3 projects.
Make that motion, given what's on the agenda tonight.
It's recommendation. It's our feedback to council.
It's too vague. I can't support it. It's too vague.
Okay.
Staff can include things that we've discussed in this.
Yes, I would appreciate it if staff would note that these issues were raised.
Yep,
I'm
we
trying.
have our notes.
Thank you.
Is that all for that item? I can't believe it.
It is.
Holy smokes. I've lost my agenda.
We are on to
Public comments?
public input.
Public input?
But may I request that we put a discussion of design review on our June 3rd agenda?
Fine.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you all. This has been a long process, but actually a short one, but intense. So I think we're ready to adjourn.
Chair,
Mr. McKinnon.
Jing, is there any idea when the Carl Thorpe motion will come back?
Because we received correspondence alleging violations of their prior permit, the matter has been referred to code enforcement, so the item will not be brought back until that investigation is complete, so we don't have a known date yet, but it will be renoticed again when it's brought back to the commission.
Thank you.
And I will volunteer to speak on this item when it gets to the city council and would welcome anybody else who wants to participate in that.
Oh, I think we should nominate Vice Chair Landris too.
Well, he's always there anyway. I mean, I just assume he'll be there.
He is.
I have to say, though, traffic is terrible these days getting to city council. I have a terrible time finding parking for the meetings right now. I mean,
You guys are gluttons for
He's a meeting
punishment.
junkie. Okay, so we are ready to adjourn. And I'll see
we have
you
no
all.
public comment? No general public comment?
We've had plenty of public comment, but I don't think there's any additional. Staff, is there anything more?
For the record, there's nothing additional.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much, and I will see you again in, 2 weeks?
Shortly. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
See ya.
Stop the interruptions.